She had his arm, his name on the invitation, his PR team confirming her to the press. For 4 hours, Celeste Vane moved through the most powerful room in San Francisco like she owned the floor beneath her. And then the doors opened again, and the entire room turned. Because the woman walking in was not supposed to exist. Not here. Not tonight. Nora Ashworth, the wife who was supposed to be a ghost, a name on a separation agreement, a relic of a dead marriage, crossed the ballroom in midnight blue. Armani placed her hand on Dorian's jaw like she'd been doing it for 20 years. Because she had. The photographer who spent an hour shooting Celeste pivoted without a word. The senator who'd been introduced to Celeste as a future ally turned toward Nora like a compass needle finding Nora. And Dorian, the man who had whispered futures to Celeste in dark hotel rooms from Manhattan to Napa, stood there and said nothing. Nothing at all. But here's what nobody in that ballroom knew. Yet, not Dorian, not the senator, not a single person sipping champagne under those chandeliers. Celeste Vane had a folder, an encrypted drive, and 47 documented transactions that were about to end everything. The only question was, whose side was she really on? The dress had taken 6 weeks to decide. Not because Celeste Vane was indecisive. She had never been indecisive about anything in her life. Not since the age of 9 when she'd decided, sitting in the back of a classroom in a trailer park school outside Baton Rouge, that she was going to be the smartest person in every room she ever entered, and then spent the next 22 years making good on that promise. No, the dress had taken 6 weeks because this was not a dress. It was a statement. And statements, Celeste had learned, required precision. The Crimson Valentino arrived from New York on a Tuesday, in a flat white box that smelled faintly of tissue paper and restraint. She had tried it on in the bathroom of her apartment in the Marina District, standing on the cold tile floor in bare feet, and when she looked in the mirror she had felt something unfamiliar move through her, not vanity. Exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that felt like recognition. Like the mirror was finally showing her the version of herself she had been building toward. She had not told Dorian about the dress. She wanted to watch his face when she walked in. That, she would later understand, had been the last thing she controlled about that evening. Celeste Vane was 31 years old and had already done things that most women her age spend their careers building toward. After graduating summa cum laude from LSU on a full academic scholarship, because there had been no other option, because her mother worked shifts at a hospital cafeteria and the word tuition in their household landed somewhere between rent and miracle, she had gone directly into forensic financial consulting, an industry that had not been expecting her. Forensic finance is a cold and exacting field. It asks you to look at the way money moves and find, in the invisible gaps between transactions, the shape of human deception. It is not glamorous. It is not, in the traditional sense, beautiful. But for a woman who had grown up watching her mother work double shifts and still come home with not enough, who had watched the way poverty operated not as absence but as architecture, as a system of invisible doors that kept closing in front of you, the work felt almost personal. Every fraud she uncovered was a door she forced back open. Every false record she dismantled was a lie that had once cost someone something real. She was good at it in the way some people are good at music, not merely technically proficient, but gifted with something instinctual, a capacity to hear the note that doesn't belong. Her clients were private equity firms, federal agencies, and corporations with problems they needed solved quietly. She had built, by 31, a reputation that women twice her age competed for, and a client list she kept on an encrypted server that she changed passwords to every 45 days. She was not supposed to be the kind of woman who fell for the wrong man. She told herself, repeatedly, that she hadn't. That what had happened with Dorian was a choice she had made with open eyes, in full possession of the facts. She had met him in Austin, at a closed-door energy summit in the spring of the previous year, one of those gatherings that doesn't appear on any public calendar, where the people with actual influence meet in rooms with very good coffee and no-cell reception and decide things that will shape quarterly reports 6 months later. Celeste had been there on behalf of a client investigating a clean energy with opaque subsidiaries. Dorian had been there because the clean energy sector was, at that moment, the frontier his empire was pressing into most aggressively. She had noticed him before he noticed her, or so she believed. And the belief mattered, because it meant she was in control. He was tall and lean in the particular way of men who have always been comfortable taking up space. With dark hair going silver at the temples and the kind of stillness in crowds that read, depending on your disposition, either as arrogance or as confidence. She had registered him, categorized him, and returned her attention to the panel discussion. Then he had appeared at her elbow during the break and said, without preamble, you've been watching the CFO more carefully than the speaker. Either you're suspicious of him or you know something interesting about his firm. She had looked at him directly. Both. He had smiled then, not the easy smile of a man performing charm, but something narrower and more specific. The smile of a person who has just found something genuinely interesting in an environment full of things that are merely expensive. Dorian Ashworth, I know who you are. And she did. She had done her research, as she did on everyone in that room. What she hadn't researched, what she hadn't thought to weight appropriately, was the particular frequency at which his attention. Dorian Ashworth, she would come to understand over the next 2 days, had a way of making you feel like the only fixed point in a room full of motion. He asked questions that were too specific to be polite and too perceptive to be flattery. He remembered things she mentioned in passing. He didn't try to impress her. He tried to understand her. And understanding, she would discover, was a far more dangerous weapon than impressiveness. By the end of the summit, he had invited her to dinner. She had accepted. She told herself it was strategic. Networking. A useful proximity to a man at the intersection of clean energy, private infrastructure, and federal contracting. She did not tell herself it was because she had laughed, genuinely laughed, for the first time in months. Somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, the story of his marriage came on the third night, in a suite at the Four Seasons overlooking Lady Bird Lake, the water black and glittering below them. He had been quiet for a long moment after dinner, and she had watched him in the way she watched things she didn't yet understand, cataloging the silence. My marriage, he said finally, with the careful phrasing of a man who has thought about how to say something for a long time, is not what it appears to be, publicly. It hasn't been for several years. Celeste had said nothing. She had learned, early in her career, that silence was the most efficient extraction tool available. He told her about Nora, not cruelly, not with the contemptuous dismissal she had heard from other men discussing wives they had outgrown. He spoke about her with a kind of detached respect, the way you speak about an institution you've aged out of. They had met young, he said. Old money families, an alliance that had made sense to their parents and, for a while, to them. But they had been separate in everything meaningful, for years. They maintained appearances for professional reasons, his board, her philanthropic commitments, but the marriage was finished. Why haven't you divorced? Celeste asked. Complexity, he said. Assets, timing, and then, looking at her in a way that felt uncomfortably direct, the right reason hasn't materialized until recently. She had understood what he meant. She hadn't let herself respond to it, not that night, but she had filed it. She had felt it move through her like something warm and involuntary. And then she had packed that feeling very carefully away in the locked room she kept for things she was not yet ready to examine. She was not naive. She wanted to be absolutely clear about that, not to anyone else, but to herself. Standing in her own mind at the witness stand. She was not naive. She was careful. She was methodical. She was a woman who verified everything. And so, in the weeks that followed, as their connection deepened across hotel rooms and late-night phone calls, and the particular intimacy of two people who work at the same level of intensity and finally recognize each other, she had asked for evidence. Dorian had provided it. An email thread with Nora, a drafted separation agreement with both signatures, a legal document registering a Pacific Heights penthouse as a property investment in Celeste's name, routed through an investment holding company that Dorian described as a legitimate asset placement strategy. He showed her with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that Celeste operated in evidence, not in. She had read every document carefully. She had searched the holding company name and found it registered in Delaware, which was unremarkable. She had cross-referenced the penthouse address against San Francisco property records and confirmed the registration. What she had not done, what she would turn over in her mind later, in the cold hours of assessment, was run a full beneficiary trace on the holding company. She had stopped one layer too early. Not out of carelessness. Out of something she would eventually name correctly as hope. The forensic consultant had trusted the spreadsheet because the spreadsheet was what she had instead of the feeling she was suppressing. And you cannot audit your own blind spots. But here's the thing about Celeste Vane. The part that Dorian had failed to fully account for when he constructed his architecture around her. She also started a folder. Not because she suspected him. Not consciously. Not at first. But 6 weeks into the affair, in the same automatic, survival-grade way that she changed her passwords every 45 days and kept backups on encrypted drives she stored in locations she had told no one about. She started a folder. She noted transactions. She flagged patterns. She documented, with the quiet, unhurried precision of a woman who had been building protection since childhood, the things that didn't add up. She didn't look at the folder often. She didn't want to look at it, but she kept it. She kept it the way a woman who grew up in a trailer park keeps $100 in cash inside a book she never reads, not because she expects disaster, but because she has never in her life been in a position to be caught without options. The 6 weeks before the gala were the best of the affair, and Celeste knew, even as she was living them, that she was paying attention with unusual intensity. The way you pay attention to something beautiful when some quiet part of you already knows the season is turning. Dorian was everywhere. His attention, when it was on her, was complete in a way that still caught her off guard. The way he called from Singapore at 11 at night, just to tell her he'd read her white paper on layered subsidiary fraud and had 2 questions about the 3rd section. The way he had shown up to San Francisco one Thursday, without warning, with 2 bottles of good wine and the specific kind of ease that made her apartment feel, for a few hours, like it belonged to a life she was choosing rather than building. The gala invitation arrived by courier. Cream cart stock, both their names embossed in gold. Dorian Ashworth and Celeste Vane. An invitation to the Whitmore Foundation Gala at the Fairmont Hotel, San Francisco's most exclusive philanthropic gathering. The kind of evening that existed at the intersection of old money, new tech, and the political relationships that connected both. She had held the card for a long time. She understood what it meant. He was not simply bringing her. He was introducing her. This was the line between private and public. The moment a secret becomes a story. She called her closest friend, a tax attorney named Dana, who had known her since law school orientation and had the particular gift of people who love you of telling you exactly what they think without making it about themselves. Is this what I think it is? Celeste asked. Dana was quiet for a moment. What do you think it is? I think it's him making it official. And what does your gut say? Celeste looked at the cream card in her hand, at her name, embossed in gold. My gut says I've earned this. Dana was quiet again, slightly longer. Your gut is not the same thing as your instinct, she said finally. You know that, right? Celeste did know that. She chose, in that moment, to set the distinction. She ordered the Crimson Valentino the following morning. The night of the gala, San Francisco was cold and clear in the particular way of late autumn evenings on the bay. The sky above the Fairmont, a deep navy that seemed designed by someone who understood. Celeste had taken 2 hours to prepare, not anxiously, but with the deliberate attention she brought to anything that mattered. Her dark hair swept up, the diamonds at her throat, a pair of diamond drop earrings that had been her one real luxury purchase at 30, the celebration she had given herself the year her billings crossed a number she had set as a marker when she was still in school. The crimson dress, the heels she'd worn twice before, both times in rooms full of important people, both times successfully. She had looked in the mirror before she left and thought, this is the version of me that was always coming. I just had to get here. Dorian met her in the lobby. He looked at her the way she had hoped he would. And the thing inside her that she had been carefully managing for 18 months expanded briefly, warmly, before she packed it back into its proper place. Ready? He said. Always. And they walked through the gilded doors of the Fairmont ballroom and into the last 4 hours of the life she thought she was building. The ballroom at the Fairmont is the kind of room that makes people temporarily forget who they are outside of it. High ceilings with gilded molding, chandeliers that throw light in every direction at once. The particular hum of a room where everyone is performing the best version of themselves and knows everyone else is doing the same, and has made a collective unspoken agreement to find this admirable rather than absurd. For 4 hours, Celeste was Dorian's center of gravity. She was introduced formally by him, in the practiced way of a man presenting someone he wants taken seriously, to the editor of a West Coast lifestyle magazine, to the wife of a California state senator, to 2 venture capitalists whose firm Celeste recognized from regulatory filings she'd reviewed 18 months earlier, to a foundation board member whose name she'd seen in a deposition once and filed away. She moved through the room on his arm and felt the particular recalibration that happened when people met her. The micro-adjustment as they processed the combination of her face, her name, her bearing, and Dorian's obvious investment in her presence. She had spent her career in rooms where she was underestimated, in rooms where her credentials did the work of announcing her because she had not been born into the kind of name that announced itself. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, she felt the balance tip. She felt seen not as the brilliant girl from Baton Rouge who had fought her way to the table, but simply as someone who belonged here. She caught herself thinking that this was what he had given her. And then she caught herself thinking that, and quietly corrected the thought. No one gives you a room. You take it. But still, the warmth was real. At some point around the 2-hour mark, Dorian was pulled into a conversation with 2 men in dark suits who had the practiced opacity of who operate in the space between politics and finance, and Celeste had drifted to the edge of the room, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing tray and letting herself simply observe. She was good at observing. She did some of her best work in observation. The room was full of people who had something to protect. She could always tell, not from any single indicator, but from the accumulated pattern of small choices. Who someone smiled at before they reached them, how far they leaned in when they listened, how their body shifted when they mentioned certain names. Power, she had learned, was mostly a story people told with their posture. She was in the middle of cataloging one such story, a venture capitalist whose body language toward a state official was suggesting something considerably more intimate than a professional relationship. When she felt the shift, it was not audible. It was not visible. Exactly, not yet. It was the way a room changes pressure when something enters it that everyone has been waiting for. A collective intake of breath that doesn't quite happen. A stillness that spreads from the entrance outward in rings, like something dropped in still water. Celeste turned toward the doors. And the last 4 hours of the life she thought she was building ended. The woman in the doorway was not walking into a room. She was completing it. That was the only way Celeste could describe it afterward. In the specific post-mortem she ran on herself in the silence of the following days, not that Nora Ashworth entered the ballroom, but that the ballroom, suddenly, made sense in a way it hadn't before. Like a sentence whose final word had just arrived. Nora was 46 and architectural in a way that had nothing to do. Silver-streaked hair swept back with the kind of deliberate precision that reads, on women who know how to wear it, as mastery rather than age. A midnight blue Armani column gown that moved with her the way only things of extraordinary quality move, not performing, simply existing at a higher frequency. No statement jewelry, no visible effort, just the absolute weaponized composure of a woman who had never once in her life needed to announce her own arrival. She was accompanied by Senator Raymond Holt of California, not on his arm, not in the way of a date, but beside him in the particular geometry of 2 people who have shared a purpose. He was a tall man with the well-maintained solidity of someone who has been powerful long enough that power has become his natural resting place. Together they formed something that the room recognized immediately. Political cover and social legitimacy combined. The photographer, the one from the lifestyle magazine, the one who had spent over an hour shooting Celeste in various corners of the ballroom, the one whose attention had felt, at the time, like confirmation turned without a word. He crossed the floor in the smooth, automatic pivot of a man who had always known who his subject was. Celeste watched it happen. She watched the room realign. She watched the invisible architecture of the evening reveal itself. All at once, the way a piece of glass held at the wrong angle will suddenly show you your own face, and you can't imagine how you missed it. Every person in this room, she understood in that moment, had expected Nora. Every person in this room had known. Dorian moved toward his wife with the ease of long practice, and Nora crossed to him in a straight line, unhurried, scanning the room as she moved in a way that was so quick and so complete that most people in her path wouldn't have noticed she was doing it. But Celeste noticed, because Celeste did the same thing herself. Nora placed one hand on Dorian's jaw, not a dramatic gesture, not performed, but casual in the way only absolute ownership is casual, and kissed him once, slowly, in a silence that the flashbulbs then filled entirely. It was the photo of the evening. Celeste knew this before the shutter clicked. She knew, the way you know a door is going to close before it does. She stood very still. She held her champagne glass. She did not allow her face to change. Because the one thing she had, the only fortress left standing in those first seconds, was that no one in this room was going to see her break. She watched Dorian. She watched him absorb his wife's arrival with a composure that matched Nora's own. In that matching, she read something she should have read before, the particular equilibrium of two people who have rehearsed a scene together. Not love, not warmth, but coordination. The practiced neutrality of partners in something that required both of them to be present tonight. He did not look at Celeste. Not immediately. When he finally did, when Nora had turned to accept the greeting of the senator's wife, and Dorian's gaze moved, briefly, across the room. She was not sure what she read in his expression. It was not guilt. It was closer to calculation. The assessment of a situation against a plan. And then Nora turned. She looked directly at Celeste. Across 30 feet of gilded ballroom, across the sound of the string quartet, and the low roar of conversation, and the particular white noise of expensive people performing themselves, Nora Ashworth found Celeste's eyes with the precision of a woman who had known exactly where she was standing. She held the look for 1 second. Then, she crossed the room. Celeste did not move. She stood and watched Nora approach and told herself, with all the force of 22 years of discipline, "Miss Vane," Nora said. Her voice was low and even, with the specific music of a woman who had been educated in the kind of where they teach you that volume is for people who are uncertain. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." Every syllable was precise, not cruel. Precision and cruelty were not the same thing. Celeste knew this from her work, but precision used correctly was something considerably more unsettling. "Mrs. Ashworth," Celeste said, and she was proud, later, of how steady her own voice was. "I can't say the same, but I imagine you expected that." Something moved very briefly in Nora's expression. Not offense, closer to interest. The recalibration of a person who expected resistance and is pleased to find it. "I'd like to speak privately," Nora said. "There's a sitting room just off the east corridor. I think what I have to say to you is worth 10 minutes of your time." She paused. Possibly considerably more than that. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. She thought about saying no. She thought about the various moves available to her in this position. Confront Dorian publicly, maintain the evening on the social surface while quietly evacuating her inner state. None of them. She recognized with the cold part of her brain that was already running calculations, gave her as much information as going with Nora. "Lead the way," Celeste said. The sitting room off the east corridor was small and perfect and smelled, Celeste would remember for the rest of her life, of old roses and older money. 2 Victorian chairs upholstered in dusky green, a side table with a bottle of wine already open, a 2007 Burgundy G. She would later identify as a Chambal Musigny of serious pedigree. 2 glasses already poured. 2. Celeste looked at the glasses and felt the first real cold thing move through her. This had been prepared. "Sit down, please," Nora said, with the polite authority of a woman who owns rooms she does not need to assert ownership. They sat. Nora lifted her wine. Celeste did not lift her. "I want to establish something first," Celeste said. I'm not here for a confrontation. I'm also not here to apologize. Whatever I owe you, I'm prepared to figure that out. But I need to understand what I'm sitting down to before I agree to anything. Nora looked at her with a stillness that was almost impressive. You owe me nothing. That's actually the first thing I want you to understand. She set down her glass. What's been done to you is the thing I'm here to discuss. Celeste said nothing. She waited. And Nora Ashworth, with the calm of a woman presenting quarterly earnings, began to dismantle the past 18 months of Celeste's life. The separation agreement. The one Dorian had shown Celeste, the one with Nora's signature, the one that had made a reasonable woman feel like reasonable evidence had been provided, was a forgery. Nora had never signed it. She had a document examiner's report, commissioned 9 months ago, that identified the specific stylistic distortions in the signature reproduction. She had also, Nora noted, filed a report with her attorney at the time, as a precaution. The Pacific Heights penthouse, registered as a property investment in Celeste's name through a holding company, Dorian had described as a legitimate asset placement vehicle. The holding company was real. The registration was real. What Dorian had failed to mention, what Celeste, running a beneficiary trace, one layer too late, had not yet discovered, was that the holding company had a secondary ownership structure. The beneficial owner, beneath one additional layer of Delaware incorporation, was a trust. The trust was controlled by Nora Ashworth. The penthouse Dorian had given Celeste as a promise of her future belonged, legally, to his wife. Celeste sat very still through all of this. She absorbed it with the same quality of attention she brought to evidence in her professional life, not reacting, not yet, but receiving, filing, cross-referencing against what she already knew. She was doing something else, too, that she would not have been able to name in the moment. She was watching Nora. Watching her the way she watched all things she needed to understand, and what she was seeing was not triumph. What she was seeing was the focused, exhausted clarity of a woman who has been running a very long operation and is finally in the... She built everything toward... You're not here to humiliate me, Celeste said. It was not a question. No, Nora said. You planned this entire evening. A pause. Including having me here. Nora looked at her steadily. Specifically including having you here. Celeste was quiet for a long time. She looked down at the wine glass she still hadn't lifted, and then, with deliberate slowness, she picked it up and... It was extraordinary wine. Of course it was. How many of us were there? She asked. Nora didn't pretend not to understand the question. 4? Over 3 years. And the others? Something shifted in Nora's composure, then the first hairline fracture in the elegance. Something that was not quite guilt, but was related to it. The expression of a person who has made a choice they stand behind and also knows what it cost. To have collapsed careers. One is facing federal fraud charges for transactions she participated in without understanding she was being used as a legal proxy. All 3 were brilliant women who made the same mistake you made, trusting evidence that had been constructed for them. She paused. I watched it happen to each of them. I was building my case. And you let them go down, Celeste said. Not accusingly, factually. I needed more time. I needed the right last piece. Nora held her gaze. The right last... The sitting room was very quiet. Outside, muffled through the walls, the Fairmont ballroom hummed with the sound of 400 people who had no idea what was happening in this small green-carpeted room, where 2 women were sitting with a very good bottle of wine, and the remains of one man's empire spread between them like a blueprint. He used us as financial proxies, Celeste said slowly, working it through. He ran transactions through women he'd embedded in his world deeply enough that our fingerprints would be on things. So if anything ever surfaced, he had plausible insulation? Nora said. Yes. Brilliant. Ambitious women with professional credibility. The kind of women whose culpability would be the story, rather than his. Celeste set down her glass. She looked at her hands. The hands of a forensic financial consultant. The hands that had, 6 weeks into an affair with Dorian Ashworth, started a folder on an encrypted drive in a safety deposit box 4 blocks away. Because a girl from Baton Rouge who never trusted anything she didn't verify had never, not once in her life, fully let her guard down. Not even when she wanted to. Especially when she wanted. I have 47 documented transactions, Celeste said. Wire transfers, shell company movements, and 2 instances of securities fraud that route directly to Dorian's personal account. She looked up. I also have recordings. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. She counted them. Nora stared at her with an expression that moved through several states in rapid succession. Surprise, which she almost suppressed entirely. Reassessment, which she did not bother to conceal. And then something that was not quite admiration, but was made of the same material. Then she smiled. It was the first real expression she had worn all evening. The mask had not slipped. It had simply been set aside. By a woman who had decided that in this room, with this person, she did not need it. I have 63 documented items, Nora said, but I am missing the routing codes for the Austin transfers. The ones from the Energy Summit in the spring of last year. Celeste looked at her for a long moment. The Energy Summit in Austin, spring of last year, where she had met Dorian, where she had been present, professionally, precisely because a client had asked her to investigate a clean energy firm with opaque subsidiary structures. A firm that, she now understood, was connected to Ashworth Global Ventures. The information she had collected then, the routing information, the transfer code, the data she had preserved in her professional capacity, and then cross-referenced against everything she had subsequently seen in Dorian's world, sat on an encrypted drive in a safety deposit box at a Wells Fargo branch in the financial district, 4 blocks from the Fairmont Hotel. I have those, Celeste said. Nora Ashworth looked at her across the ruins of an evening that had been, from its first invitation to its last orchestrated arrival, a trap that had caught the wrong person. And then, in that small room that smelled of old roses and older money, with the muffled sound of the city's most powerful people existing in beautiful ignorance just beyond the wall, something new was built in the space where something else had just been destroyed. Not friendship, not yet. Something more immediate than that. An alliance forged in the specific fire of 2 women who had both been made into instruments and had, separately and in parallel, decided to become the musicians instead. I have a meeting with my attorney tomorrow morning, Nora said, with the measured calm of a person who has been planning this sentence for a long time. I'd like you to attend. Celeste looked at the wine in her glass, at the choice laid out in front of her, at the shape of the next chapter, visible now, for the first time, in full. What time? She said. The morning after the gala? San Francisco was silver and cold. Celeste had been awake since 4. She lay in her apartment in the Marina District and listened to the foghorn from the bay and ran through everything with a methodical, unhurrying pace. She brought to the most complex cases, the ones where the emotional stakes were high enough to distort analysis, where you had to be especially careful about the difference between what you knew and what you felt. She made 2 columns in her head. Evidence, response. In the evidence column, she placed the following: a marriage that had never been dissolved, a separation agreement that was a forgery, a penthouse that was a legal trap, 3 women before her, scattered across Denver, Nashville, and Miami, their careers and their credibility in various states of ruin, 47 documented transactions that she had collected over 8 months with the unconscious, automatic self-protection of a woman who had never once in her life been in a position to be caught without option. And Nora Ashworth, cool, precise, devastating Nora Ashworth, who had constructed the entire evening like a controlled demolition, who had waited 3 years for the precise intersection of readiness and the right partner, and who had, for reasons Celeste was still cataloging, decided that partner was her. In the response column, she placed the following: what she was going to do next. She was at the attorney's office at 8:15. Nora arrived at 8:30. The attorney was a woman named Frances Gould, 62, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific economy of movement that belongs to people who have won very difficult fights and no longer need to perform preparation. She shook Celeste's hand with 2 firm pumps and said, "I've read everything Nora has told me about you. I'm glad you're in the room. Celeste sat down at the conference table. Nora sat across from her. For a moment, in the clear morning light coming through the window, they looked at each other without the architecture of the previous night between them. Nora looked tired. Not diminished, the composure was still there, still structural, still load-bearing but human in a way she hadn't been in the ballroom. The quality of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, last night, set it down in a place where someone else can help hold it. Celeste thought briefly about what that weight must have felt like. 3 years of documentation, 3 women she had watched fall, a marriage she had stayed inside, not out of love or fear, but because leaving would have warned him. And warning him would have meant he moved the assets and protected himself and walked away clean the way men of his particular kind were structurally arranged to do. She had stayed and watched and built her case, and it had cost her something. Celeste could see it in the slight hollowness around her eyes that the Fairmont chandeliers had hidden. She didn't say anything about it, but she noted it, and she held it with a specific kind of respect she reserved for things that had required more from someone than she could fully measure. Frances opened a folder, and they went to work. The morning lasted for hours. By noon, the shape of what they had was clear. Nora's documentation covered 63 items: wire transfers, asset movements, shell company transactions, board minutes that had been altered, and a series of off-book financial instruments that had been structured to appear. Unrelated to Dorian personally, while routing benefit to him exclusively, she had worked with a forensic accountant of her own for 18 months and a private investigator before that. Celeste's 47 items provided the missing connective tissue. The Austin routing codes she had collected in her professional capacity during the Energy Summit were precisely what they had suspected. The originating transfers that linked the shell company structure in California to the energy sector deals in Texas and the Pacific Northwest, establishing a pattern of racketeering that was jurisdictionally federal. The 2 instances of securities fraud she had documented were particularly significant. They were direct enough, and Celeste's professional standing as a forensic financial consultant was established enough that her evidence alone, stripped of anything Nora provided, would constitute a credible basis for an SEC. Combined, they were something considerably more than that. "There's an existing investigation," Frances said, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone presenting information they have been waiting to present for a long time. "Jointly initiated 6 months ago by my office and the office of Senator Holt, FBI and SEC. It has been in the evidence-gathering phase, waiting for 2 specific things: the Austin routing codes and a witness with professional credentials who can speak to the forensic financial structure." She looked at Celeste. "You are both of those things." Celeste looked at the table for a moment. She thought about Dorian in the suite at the Four Seasons, the city lights on the water below, the particular warmth of feeling seen by someone you have decided to trust. She held the memory at a slight remove, the way you hold something hot, not dropping it, not pretending it doesn't exist, but not letting it burn you either. Then she looked up. "What do you need from me?" she said. Frances told her. It was not simple, and it was not fast, but it was clear. And clarity was the thing Celeste had always been able to work with, regardless of what the clarity contained. The weeks that followed were the most precise of Celeste's professional life. She moved through them with the focused velocity of someone who has found the work that is most specifically hers, not just technically, but morally, structurally. She spent long days in conference rooms with federal attorneys and forensic accountants, walking through transaction chains and shell company layers with the fluency of a woman who had spent her career doing exactly this. She was deposed twice. She submitted 112 pages of documented analysis. She was cross-referenced, challenged, and confirmed. She also did something she had not anticipated. She called Dana. Dana answered on the second ring with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a call they knew was coming and was trying to be patient about the timing. "I owe you an acknowledgement," Celeste said. "You don't owe me anything," Dana said. "My gut and my instincts are not the same." "You were right." A pause. "Are you okay?" Celeste considered the question honestly. She was in her apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the evening light coming through the window and the bay visible in the distance, and she searched herself carefully, not broken. She was something more complicated than okay and less simple than fine, but she was intact. She was, in the most important sense, herself. Yes, she said. But thank you for asking. What happens now? Celeste looked out at the bay. Now I finish the work. She had not told Dorian anything. He had called twice after the gala, once with the careful, controlled phrasing of a man assessing damage, once with something that sounded, if you didn't know what you were listening for, like concern. She had let both calls go to voicemail. She had given both recordings to Francis. She had not seen him in person. She had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not need whatever conversation she might have needed to have with him. The accounting of the betrayal, the naming of the lies had been rendered unnecessary by the more complete language of evidence. There was nothing she could say to him across a table that would be as thorough, as accurate, or as permanent as what she was building with Francis and Nora and the federal attorneys who were, quietly and without announcement, constructing the cage that would contain him. She did think about him. She was honest with herself about that. Not constantly, not with the consuming quality of grief, but in the specific way you think about something that was real, because what she had felt had been real, even if the architecture around it was entirely false. You could not simply subtract the feeling because the context had been fraudulent. The feeling had happened. She had had it. It was part of the ledger of her life, and she was too honest a person to forge her own document. But she also thought, with growing frequency, about something else. She thought about the 3 women in Denver, Nashville, and Miami. She thought about what it would have taken to have someone in Celeste's position. Someone who understood the financial architecture at the level she did. Standing beside them when the machinery started turning on them. She thought about the particular compounding damage of financial fraud when it intersects with personal betrayal. The way it strips a woman not just of money but of credibility, of narrative, of the right to tell her own story without having it immediately reframed as complete. She thought about the folder she had started 6 weeks into the affair. The automatic, survival-grade reflex that had saved her. And she thought about all the women who were brilliant and self-made and capable, who did not have her specific professional training, who had not grown up in circumstances that had hardwired self-preservation into them alongside ambition. She began to make notes, different notes than the ones she had been making for Francis, notes about a different kind of project. 3 weeks after the gala, on a Tuesday morning that was cold and bright, Dorian Ashworth was arrested at San Francisco International Airport. He had been at the private aviation terminal with 2 pieces of luggage and a scheduled flight to Zurich, which suggested either that he had been warned or that whatever arrogance had sustained the operation for 3 years had finally cracked under its own weight and he had decided to move rather than hold. He was intercepted before boarding. Celeste heard about it from Francis at 7:15 in the morning. In a phone call that lasted for minutes and conveyed, in Francis's characteristic economy of language, everything necessary. Simultaneous asset freezes had been executed across San Francisco, Austin, and Chicago. The charges were substantial: securities fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and the criminal use of civilian proxies, the last of which was a charge Francis had specifically argued for, designed to account for the 3 women whose lives had been run through the mechanism of Dorian's construction. Celeste sat with her coffee in the morning light and felt something. She had been expecting to feel more dramatically than she actually did. It was not triumph. It was quieter than, closer to the particular relief of a room whose walls have finally settled, when a structure that has been holding a false shape for a long time is finally allowed to collapse into its actual dimensions. She sent Dana a text that said, "Done." Dana sent back, "Wine tonight." Celeste sent, "Obviously." The settlement process took several weeks. Her attorney, a woman she had hired on Francis's recommendation, a former federal prosecutor named Gloria Chun, who moved through complex financial litigation with a speed that Celeste found genuinely impressive, argued that the Pacific Heights penthouse, registered in Celeste's name through a shell company structure that constituted fraudulent property entrapment, rightfully belonged to her. The argument succeeded. Celeste stood in the penthouse on the afternoon she received confirmation in the high bright rooms with the view of the bay, and looked at the space for a long time. The floors were pale oak. The light came in from 3 expodas. The kitchen was the kind of kitchen that serious people cook in. It was, by every material measure, the most beautiful space she had ever occupied. She had lived her whole life in spaces that were one step above inadequate. She had earned, through 2 decades of relentless work, the right to stand in a room like this. She listed it with an agent the following morning. The capital from the sale went into a seed fund she had been quietly structuring. In the notes she had been making alongside the deposition documents, the notes about a different kind of project, Vane Advisory, offices in San Francisco and Austin, specializing in forensic financial protection for women in high acid relationships, the specific intersection of financial fraud and intimate betrayal that her industry had never adequately addressed. Because the industry had never had, at its center, someone who understood both from the inside. She built the advisory structure with the same precision she brought to everything. The San Francisco office was on the 14th floor of a building on Market Street, with a view of the bay that she had not sought out intentionally and then did not reevaluate. The Austin office was smaller, in a building near the university, because the proximity to graduate programs in finance and law seemed right because she wanted to be near the early versions of the women she was trying to reach. Her first client came through Nora's attorney, a referral that arrived without fanfare. A woman in Seattle whose circumstances had a different geometry than Celeste's, but the same structural pattern. A brilliant person who had been used as financial insulation by someone she trusted. Celeste spent 2 weeks on the case. She was thorough, and she was right, and the outcome was significantly better than it would have been without her. She did not tell the client about the Fairmont, or the Gala, or Dorian, or the Crimson Valentino. Those were her documents, and she kept them in the locked room. But they informed the work in every choice she made, every question she knew to ask, every pattern she recognized before it completed. Every time she looked at a woman across a conference table who was trying to maintain composure while her understanding of her own life rearranged itself in real time, she knew that room. She had built herself in that room. She was going to make sure the view from inside it was no longer something you had to navigate alone. The divorce proceedings were not a story Celeste followed closely. She had her own architecture to build, and she had made a private decision early on that whatever happened in the formal dissolution of the Ashworth marriage was Nora's story to tell or not tell, not Celeste's to monitor. But she heard things, as you hear things in a city the size of San Francisco, where the distance between powerful people is always shorter than it looks. The documentation Nora submitted was described by people who had seen it as comprehensive to the point of being almost overwhelming. 3 years of careful, meticulous collection that turned the divorce proceedings from a negotiation into something closer to a formal accounting. Dorian's legal team spent weeks simply cataloging what they were facing before they could begin to respond to it. The settlement, when it came, was substantial. Nora did not discuss the terms publicly. What she did discuss, in a single interview with a journalist she had chosen specifically and carefully, was a decision to stay. Not out of love, she said, with the flat directness of a woman who has long since moved past the need for her choices to be flattering. Not out of fear or financial dependency, out of a specific strategic commitment that required proximity to I knew what he was, she said in the interview. I knew it for a long time. The question was never whether to leave. The question was whether leaving served the women he would go on to harm, or whether staying and building something served them better. She paused, and the journalist noted that she looked not triumphant but tired, the particular tiredness of someone who has finished a very long marathon and is only now beginning to feel the distance in their legs. I hope I chose correctly. I think about the 3 women who came before Celeste. I think about them a great deal. She relocated to Savannah in the spring, a restored Victorian house in the historic district that she had purchased 2 years earlier and kept empty, as if she had known she would need it eventually, a city she chose, she said, because it was the only American city that felt like it understood the weight of beautiful things with dark history. Celeste received the first bottle in October, a month after Vane Advisory opened its San Francisco office. It arrived on a Friday morning, the first Friday of the month, delivered by a courier service with no card, no note, nothing but the bottle itself. A 2007 Chambal Mazigny Burgundy, the same wine that had been poured in the sitting room off the east corridor of the Fairmont, in the small room that smelled of old roses and older money. On the night everything collapsed and something else began. She held it for a moment. She turned it in her hands. Then she put it in the small refrigerator in the corner of her office, the one she had bought without entirely knowing why, and went back to work. That evening, after the last client call, and after Gloria had sent over the preliminary documents for the Seattle case follow-up, and after Dana had texted asking about dinner and she had said Friday next week instead, she took the bottle out and opened it. She poured it into a glass she had bought specifically for wine she intended to pay attention to. The kind of thick-stemmed burgundy glass that opens the wine properly and lets you smell it before you taste it. And she stood at the window of her office on the 14th floor of the building on Market Street and looked out at the bay. It was a clear night. The lights of the Bay Bridge laid themselves on the water. The fog was coming in from the west in long, slow rolls, the way it always does, the way it has for as long as San Francisco has been a city full of people making irreversible decisions and calling them strategy. She drank the wine slowly. It was extraordinary. It was, she thought, one of the finest things she had ever tasted. The specific excellence of something that had been made right, and then held at the right temperature for exactly the right number of years, until the moment arrived when it was precisely itself. She thought about the girl in the trailer park outside Baton Rouge who had decided, at 9 years old, that she was going to be the smartest person in every room she ever entered. She thought about what that girl would have made of this room, this view, this glass. She thought she would have worked toward exactly this. She would not have imagined it, but she would have worked toward exactly this. She set the glass down. She went back to her desk. She opened the folder on her screen that contained the preliminary intake form for a new client, a woman in Portland, referred through a law firm that had heard about Vane Advisory through a mutual colleague, who needed someone who understood both the financial mechanics and the human weight of what had been done to her. Celeste read the intake form carefully. She made 3 notes in the margin. She drafted an email requesting a first meeting for the following week. Then she picked up her wine glass again and finished the last of it. The second bottle arrived on the first Friday of November, the third in December. By April, there had been 8 bottles, all 2007 Burgundy. All the same label, all delivered without a card, without a note. Without any message at all, except the one that was entirely contained in the choice of what was being sent and the timing of when it arrived. Celeste always opened them. Not immediately, not always on the Friday they arrived. Sometimes she let one sit in the small refrigerator for a week or 2 while she finished a case or prepared for a deposition, but eventually, always, she drank them slowly, usually in the evening, usually alone, usually at the window with the bay below. She and Nora did not speak often. They were not, in the technical sense, friends. Their relationship had no social scaffolding, no dinners, no warmth of the ordinary kind. What they had was something more specific than friendship and, in its way, more durable. A shared intelligence of what had been done and what had been built in response to it. A mutual respect that had been earned in a sitting room at the Fairmont rather than over years of ordinary acquaintance. Occasionally, an email arrived from Nora's attorney, flagging a case or a pattern or a financial structure that Nora had encountered in her philanthropic work and thought Celeste should know about. Occasionally, Celeste sent something back, a resource, a referral, a piece of analysis that had come out of her work at Vane Advisory and seemed relevant. It was a working relationship, a correspondence between 2 people who had, in the specific crucible of one night and its aftermath, established the terms on which they were prepared to know each other. It was enough. It was, in fact, considerable. By the end of the first year, Vane Advisory had 16 active clients, 2 senior associates, and a waiting list that Celeste was beginning to think carefully about how to manage without compromising the quality of what she had built. There had been a profile in a financial industry publication. She had agreed to it carefully and controlled what she disclosed. and to speaking invitations to conferences she had attended years earlier. As a rising figure in forensic finance, but now attended as something different, as someone who had a particular and hard-won authority on a particular and insufficiently addressed problem. She thought sometimes about what it had cost to get here. Not with bitterness, she was not a bitter person, had never had the luxury of bitterness, and had long since decided that it was a form of debt that only ever compounded, but with the specific accounting that honest people apply to their own histories. She had been deceived by a man who was exceptional at deception. She had trusted evidence that had been constructed to be trusted. She had felt things that were real for someone who had not been real with her. These were not failures. They were experiences. They were the material out of which she had built the next thing. The crimson Valentino hung in her closet. She had not worn it again. She was not sure she ever would, or whether the decision mattered. It was there. It had been part of the night, and the night had been part of everything that followed. And the dress was one of the honest things from an evening built on lies. She had worn it. She had felt something wearing it. And that had been real. She was keeping it. But she was also keeping everything she had built since. In Savannah, Nora Ashworth was planting a garden. The Victorian house had a long backyard that had been neglected for years, and she was starting from the soil up, not hiring it out, doing it herself. With the deliberate intention of someone who has spent 3 years inside a very complex, very controlled operation, and is now relearning what it feels like to make something that simply grows. She had no timeline. She had no strategy. She had a garden fork and good soil and the specific piece of a woman who has finished the longest fight of her life and is choosing carefully what she does with the quiet that she was not uncomplicated. She knew that. The 3 women in Denver, Nashville, and Miami. She thought about them the way Frances had told her she would. In the long tale of aftermath, when the operational thinking finally stilled, and the human weight of strategic choices settled where it was always going to settle, she had made a choice to let them go down in order to build a case complete enough to make the case stick. And she stood behind that choice and also understood that standing behind a choice and being at peace with it were not the same. She was working on that, slowly, with the same patience she brought to the garden. She had written to each of the 3 women personally, not through her attorney. In her own handwriting, which she knew from experience was the only correspondence that could not be misread as perceived. She had said what there was to say. 2 had not responded. 1 had written back a single line. "I'm glad it mattered." She kept that letter in the drawer of her writing desk and looked at it sometimes. She sent the wine to Celeste on the first Friday of every month because it was the right gesture, specific enough to carry meaning, quiet enough to require no response, precise in the way that Celeste would understand, and Nora, understanding Celeste, knew she would appreciate. They were women who communicated most fluently in the language of deliberate action rather than declaration. The wine was a declaration of sorts, not of friendship, exactly, of continuity, of a regard that had been forged in a specific fire and had survived into a kind of ongoing, quiet acknowledgement. Nora thought Celeste would do something important. She had thought this since the sitting room at the Fairmont, when Celeste had set down her glass and said 57 documented transactions with the controlled force of a woman who had been building her own case while being dismantled, and Nora had felt in the middle of an evening she had engineered something that surprised her. She had felt relief, not tactical, something more personal than the relief of recognizing the right person. In San Francisco, on the first Friday of a month, in the second year of Vane Advisory, a courier arrived at the 14th floor of a building on Market Street with a small package. The administrative assistant signed for it and set it on Celeste's desk. Celeste was on the phone with a client in Portland. She finished the call, made 2 notes, and looked at the package. It was the wine, the 2007 Burgundy. As always, no card. But there was something else today tucked beneath the wine, small enough that the assistant hadn't noticed it. A single folded card, cream-colored, the same cardstock as the Fairmont invitation that had arrived by courier nearly 2 years ago with both their names embossed in gold. Celeste unfolded it. 4 words, in handwriting she did not know yet but recognized as precise and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who chews every letter. "Keep going," it said. And below that, smaller, in a phrase that arrived like the last note of something she hadn't known was a song. Some women get crowned at galas. The dangerous ones get incorporated. Celeste read it twice. She set it down on her desk. She looked out at the bay, where the morning light was coming off the water in long, bright bands, and she sat with it for a moment, with all of it, the full weight and the full forward motion of it. Then she put the wine in the refrigerator, picked up her phone, and dialed the next client. She would open the wine that evening. She would drink it slowly, at the window, with the city spread out below her, and the work accumulating on her desk and the thing she was building taking the day by day of something real would keep going.